James sat behind the wheel of his old car, his hands gripping the steering wheel, tighter than usual. The streets were quiet this time of night, save for the occasional car speeding by or distant chatter from pedestrians. The air felt heavier tonight, as if it carried the weight of the day's frustrations. James had just finished his shift as a security guard at a warehouse, and exhaustion was settling deep into his bones. He glanced at the gas gauge, which hovered precariously above empty. A sigh escaped his lips. He had been living paycheck to paycheck for as long as he could remember, barely scraping by. But despite it all, he tried to stay optimistic. "Life's tough, but it ain't all bad," he often told himself. He prided himself on being kind, even when kindness was hard to afford. The rain began to drizzle, tapping gently against the windshield, and James pulled his thin jacket tighter around himself. He was ready to head home when something caught his eye, a lone figure standing by the side of the road. A man, soaking wet, with his thumb out, hoping for a ride. James hesitated, his foot lingering over the accelerator. He wasn't sure if stopping was a good idea. The streets could be unpredictable, and he had learned not to trust easily. Yet there was something about the man that made him reconsider. The stranger stood slouched, shivering in the cold. His eyes carried a quiet kind of desperation. James shook his head with a small chuckle. "Man, I must be crazy," he muttered to himself. But before he could second-guess his decision, he slowed the car to a stop, leaning over to roll down the passenger window. "Need a ride?" James called out. The man's head jerked up, and for a moment, James could see the surprise in his eyes, as if he wasn't used to kindness from strangers. He nodded quickly. "Yeah, if it's not too much trouble. I'm trying to get downtown." James unlocked the door, and the stranger slid into the passenger seat, his wet clothes leaving dark stains on the worn-out upholstery. The smell of rain mixed with something faintly metallic. "No trouble at all," James replied, glancing at the man. "Name's James." "Appreciate this, man." "I'm Robert," the stranger said, offering a weary smile. His eyes, though tired, carried an air of gratitude. The car fell into a comfortable silence as James steered back onto the road. The rain picked up, and the windshield wipers thumped rhythmically. James cast a quick glance at Robert, noticing how the man stared out the window, lost in thought. There was a story behind those eyes, but James didn't ask. It wasn't his business. He was just a ride, nothing more, nothing less. After a few minutes of silence, Robert spoke up, his voice low and measured. "Funny how life works sometimes, isn't it? One day you're on top of the world, and the next—" He trailed off, staring out into the rain-soaked streets. James raised an eyebrow but kept his eyes on the road. "Yeah, I know the feeling," he muttered as if to himself. Robert chuckled dryly. "You don't seem like the kind of guy who catches a lot of breaks either, huh?" James smirked. "You could say that, but you keep going. Ain't much else to do." Robert nodded, his expression softening. "That's real. Sometimes it's the small things that keep you moving, right? A kind word, a little gesture, or—" He glanced over at James, his eyes gleaming with something unreadable. "A free ride on a rainy night," James laughed lightly, the sound breaking through the gloom. "Guess you're right about that." For a moment, the two men sat in comfortable silence again, the rhythmic sounds of rain filling the space between them. "So, what brings you out here this late?" James asked, more out of curiosity than politeness. Robert hesitated, as if deciding how much to say. "Let's just say, things didn't go the way I thought they would. Lost my job. Lost a few other things along the way, too." His voice was steady, but James could hear the weight behind his words. James nodded, not pressing for more. He knew what it was like to lose things. The specifics didn't matter. Pain was pain, no matter the shape it took. The car approached a red light, and James tapped the brakes, glancing over at Robert again. "Hey man, look. I know how it feels when life kicks you around. But it doesn't last forever. You just gotta keep moving. One day things'll turn around." Robert turned to look at James, his gaze sharp and thoughtful. "I appreciate that. I really do." There was something in Robert's voice, a quiet kind of gratitude that felt heavier than the words themselves. The light turned green, and James pressed the gas, the tires splashing through puddles on the slick road. Neither man knew it yet, but the night was far from ordinary. This simple act of kindness, just a ride on a rainy night, would mark the beginning of a journey neither of them could have predicted. The rain thickened, blurring the streetlights into hazy orbs of gold. James adjusted the windshield wipers, their rhythmic whooshing cutting through the silence in the car. Robert shifted slightly in his seat, resting his head against the cold window glass. For a while, it seemed like the night might end quietly, just two strangers sharing a brief encounter before returning to their separate lives. But as they neared downtown, Robert spoke again, his voice low but distinct. "Actually, you can drop me off anywhere around here. I don't have a place right now." James frowned, glancing at Robert. "You mean, you homeless?" Robert gave a small nod, his eyes never leaving the rain-streaked window. "Yeah, just one of those things that sneaks up on you, you know? One bad decision, a little bad luck, and before you know it, everything's gone." James tightened his grip on the steering wheel. He knew how fragile life could be, how one missed bill, one lost job, could send a person spiraling into a place they never thought they'd end up. "Nah, man," James said, shaking his head. "I ain't just gonna leave you out here in the rain. That don't sit right with me." Robert turned, surprised. "I appreciate it, but I don't want to be any trouble." "It's no trouble," James replied firmly. "Look, I know how it feels when you think nobody cares, and I know it helps when somebody does." A flicker of emotion crossed Robert's face, something between gratitude and disbelief. "You don't even know me." James gave him a sideways glance. "Yeah, well, sometimes that's when it matters most." For the first time since the ride began, Robert smiled, a small, tired smile but real. "Thanks, man," James nodded. "I know a shelter not far from here. I can take you there. It's dry and they won't bother you." Robert hesitated, but after a moment, he gave a reluctant nod. "All right, that sounds good." The two men settled back into silence as James drove through the wet streets, the car's heater humming softly between them. James pulled up in front of the shelter, its dim neon sign flickering in the rain. A few people lingered under the awning, their faces weary from the burdens they carried. Robert stared at the building, an unreadable expression on his face. As James shifted the car into park, Robert turned toward him, his eyes filled with something close to shame. "I really appreciate this, James. I don't know how to repay you, man." "You don't owe me anything," James replied sincerely. "Just take care of yourself, all right?" Robert gave a slow nod and reached for the door handle. But just as he opened the door, the sound of another vehicle pulling up beside them caught their attention. A sleek black car rolled to a stop. The windows were tinted, but the license plate caught Robert's eye. He froze. "No way," Robert whispered, his breath catching in his throat. Before James could ask what was going on, the door to the black car swung open, and a well-dressed man stepped out, holding an umbrella. His eyes scanned the entrance to the shelter until they landed on Robert. "Robert?" the man said, his voice filled with disbelief. Robert slumped back into his seat, looking like he'd seen a ghost. "Of all the places," he muttered under his breath. James sat silently, watching the exchange unfold. The man standing outside was clearly someone important. His sharp suit and polished shoes screamed wealth, and the way he looked at Robert, it was as if he had been searching for him for a long time. Robert opened the door fully and stepped out into the rain. The man rushed forward, his umbrella covering both of them. "I've been looking for you for months, Robert," the man said, his voice thick with relief. "I thought you were gone. What happened to you?" Robert glanced back at James, then turned to the man with a small, resigned smile. "Long story, Sam. A real long story." James sat in stunned silence, trying to make sense of what he was seeing. Clearly, Robert wasn't just a homeless man down on his luck. There was a connection here, something deeper than James could have imagined. "Come with me," the man named Sam said urgently. "We have so much to talk about. You can't stay here." Robert hesitated, glancing back at James one last time. Their eyes met, and for a moment, neither man spoke. "Thanks for everything, James," Robert said quietly. "You don't know what this means." Before James could respond, Robert turned and climbed into the black car, disappearing into the night. James sat alone in his car, the rain drumming against the windshield, wondering what had just happened and why it felt like this wasn't the end of the story. A few days passed, but James couldn't get that night out of his head. He kept replaying the strange encounter, the rain, the shelter, and most of all, the way Robert had been whisked away by someone who seemed far more important than he had let on. Something about it gnawed at him. It had just been a simple act of kindness, nothing more, nothing less. Or so James thought. Then, one evening after his shift, as James was getting ready to head home, his phone buzzed with a message. It was from a number he didn't recognize. The message was brief. "Need to meet. It's Robert. You free tomorrow?" James stared at the screen, surprised. He wasn't expecting to hear from Robert again. Part of him thought their brief connection was just a fleeting moment in the grand scheme of things. But now Robert wanted to meet. Curiosity piqued, James replied with a simple, "Sure." The next day, James arrived at the coffee shop Robert had mentioned in his message. It wasn't one of the fancy places downtown, just a small, cozy spot tucked away from the main streets. As he walked inside, he spotted Robert immediately, sitting at a corner table with a calm, content look on his face. But Robert looked different now, more put together, wearing clean clothes, and carrying himself with an ease James hadn't seen before. "James!" Robert greeted him warmly as he stood up to shake his hand. "Man, I'm so glad you came." "Didn't expect to hear from you," James admitted, taking a seat. "You look different." Robert chuckled. "Yeah, well, a lot can change in a few days, and that's what I wanted to talk to you about." He leaned forward, his expression serious but filled with gratitude. "I need you to know something, James. That night, when you gave me that ride, you saved my life." James blinked, caught off guard. "What?" "Nah, man, I just gave you a ride, that's all." Robert shook his head. "It wasn't just a ride, James. I was at rock bottom that night. I'd lost everything. My job, my place, my dignity. I was ready to give up. If you hadn't stopped, I don't know where I'd be right now." James shifted uncomfortably in his seat, not sure how to respond. He hadn't thought much about that night, other than feeling good that he'd helped someone in need. But now Robert was telling him that his small gesture had been the turning point in his life. "And it gets crazier," Robert continued, a smile spreading across his face. "Remember that guy who picked me up? Sam?" James nodded. "Yeah, he seemed like someone important." Robert laughed softly. "You could say that. He's not just a friend, he's a business partner. Or he was, before I screwed things up. We started a company together, but I made some bad decisions and lost everything. I didn't think he'd ever want to see me again, but that night, he showed up. I guess he'd been looking for me, hoping to fix things." James listened in silence, processing Robert's words. "Sam's giving me another chance, James," Robert said, his voice filled with emotion. "He's bringing me back into the company, and I owe it all to you. If you hadn't picked me up that night, I wouldn't be here today." James leaned back in his chair, still struggling to wrap his head around the situation. "Man, I don't know what to say," he admitted. Robert smiled. "You don't have to say anything. I just needed you to know." And he paused, then reached into his pocket and pulled out a small envelope. "There's one more thing." He slid the envelope across the table toward James, who stared at it suspiciously. "What's this?" James asked, his brows furrowed. "Open it," Robert urged, grinning. James picked up the envelope and tore it open. Inside was a neatly folded piece of paper, a letter, and a check. His heart skipped a beat as he read the number on the check. It was far more than he could have ever imagined. "I know you didn't ask for anything," Robert said softly, "and I know you weren't expecting this, but I want you to have it. Consider it a thank you and a start." James shook his head, overwhelmed. "Man, I can't take this. This is too much." "It's not too much," Robert replied firmly. "This is what you deserve. You saved my life, James. And now, I want to help you change yours." For a moment, James sat in stunned silence, the weight of the gesture sinking in. He had spent so many years struggling, scraping by, trying to do the right thing without ever expecting anything in return. And now here it was, an opportunity he hadn't asked for, but desperately needed. "But it's not just about the money," Robert added. "I've got something else for you too. Sam and we're expanding the business, and we need someone we can trust, someone with heart. I want you to come work with us." James stared at Robert, speechless. "You're serious?" he finally managed to say. "As serious as it gets," Robert answered, smiling warmly. "This isn't just a handout, James. It's a second chance, for both of us." James felt a lump rise in his throat. For so long, he had believed that life was a series of struggles with no reward at the end. But now, sitting across from Robert, he realized something profound. Sometimes, the universe gives back when you least expect it. James sat there, still reeling from the weight of Robert's words. His hands trembled slightly as he held the check, but it wasn't just about the money. It was the offer, the opportunity to step into a new world that he had never imagined for himself. For so long, life had been about surviving, about making ends meet. But now, Robert was giving him something more than just financial help. He was offering him a purpose. "I don't know, man," James said after a long pause. "I mean, I'm just a regular guy. I don't know the first thing about business or working with people like Sam." Robert leaned forward, his eyes intense but kind. "James, that's the thing. You're more than just a regular guy. You've got something that most people in the business world don't. Heart, compassion. You see people for who they are, not what they have or don't have. That's exactly what we need. The rest? You'll learn along the way." James stared at him, trying to let it sink in. Could he really do this? Could he step into a life he had never envisioned for himself? There was doubt, sure, but there was also a spark of something else. Hope, a feeling he hadn't felt in a long time. "I won't lie to you," Robert continued. "It won't be easy. There's going to be a lot to learn, and you'll probably feel out of place at first. But you've already shown me what you're capable of, James. You've got what it takes to make a difference." James nodded slowly, the weight of the decision pressing down on him. But deep down, he knew the answer. This was more than just a job. It was a chance to rewrite his own story, to step out of the shadows of survival and into a life where he could thrive. "All right," James finally said, his voice steady. "I'm in." Robert's face lit up with a wide grin. "That's what I'm talking about. You won't regret it, James. We'll work together, and I promise you this is just the beginning." As they sat there, talking about what the future might hold, James couldn't help but think back to that rainy night, the night when he had almost driven past a stranger standing in the cold. That single decision, to stop, to help, had brought him here, to this moment where everything in his life was about to change. The weeks that followed were a whirlwind. James found himself thrust into a world he had never known, working alongside Robert and Sam in a business he had once thought was beyond his reach. There were moments of doubt, moments when he felt like an outsider in boardrooms filled with wealthy, polished individuals. But every time he questioned himself, he remembered Robert's words, that what he brought to the table was more than just knowledge. It was heart. And slowly, he began to see the truth in that. While others in the company were focused on numbers, profits, and status, James brought something different, a genuine care for the people behind the business. He treated every employee, every client, with the same respect and kindness he had shown Robert that night. And soon, people noticed. Robert had been right. James's empathy and down-to-earth perspective were exactly what the company needed. It wasn't long before he started making a real impact, helping to create initiatives that supported struggling communities, providing job opportunities for those who, like him, had once been overlooked by society. But more than that, James found himself growing as a person. He was no longer just surviving, he was thriving. He had stepped into a role where he could use his kindness, his empathy, to make a real difference. And every day, he woke up with a sense of purpose that had been missing for so long. One evening, after a particularly long day at work, James found himself sitting in the same spot in his car where he had first met Robert. He stared out at the rain-soaked streets, thinking about how far he had come. It still didn't feel real sometimes, but the rain tapping against his windshield reminded him of that night, the night that had changed everything. His phone buzzed, pulling him from his thoughts. It was a text from Robert. "You good, man? Just thinking about how far we've come. Crazy, huh?" James smiled, shaking his head. It really was crazy, but it was also proof that life could change in the blink of an eye, all because of one small act of kindness. As he drove home that night, James felt a sense of peace he hadn't known before. He had always believed in doing good, in helping others whenever he could. But now, he understood something deeper. That when you put kindness into the world, it comes back to you in ways you can't predict. And for James, that was the real reward. Not the money, not the job, but the knowledge that in helping someone else, he had unknowingly changed his own life for the better. The journey ahead wasn't going to be easy. There would be challenges, setbacks, and moments of doubt. But now, James knew one thing for sure. He wasn't alone, and he had the power to create change, not just for others, but for himself. And that, in the end, was the greatest lesson of all.